Hello, I'm Kate Gerbeau. Welcome to Sitrep, your weekly look at the big issues in defence and world affairs. This week, we're focusing on the key lessons being learnt by the British military and the defence industry here from the war in Ukraine. We'll be speaking to the Director Joint Warfare at UK Strategic Command.
The experience of the Ukraine conflict is absolutely a tragedy, but it is, I think, a once-in-a-generation opportunity to draw really profound insights and lessons from a modern Western battlefield.
We'll be hearing more shortly from Rear Admiral Andrew Betton, who's been speaking at the Defence Security Equipment International Show. And we'll speak to the former head of the Army, General Lord Dannatt, whose new book explores why Britain was unprepared for fighting the Second World War.
The Army has to take some responsibility for not having taken into itself the warfighting doctrine that it had learned so painfully during the course of the First World War.
Sitrep with Kate Gerbeau and Professor Michael Clark.
And Simon Newton is also here today. Hi, Simon. You've been run off your feet at that huge defence fair, DSEI. Looking forward to hearing more from you about that in a little while. But first, Mike, hi. Can you give us a sense of the scale of UK spending on military aid and arms to Ukraine?
It's fairly precise in numbers terms. It's 4.6 billion is committed, goes to about 5 billion when you add in some of the extras. And, that compares it's less than a tenth of what the Americans are spending, but we're still the second biggest spender. And so, as usual, the Americans are putting in, so far they've put in almost 50 billion, and they're going up towards 90 billion. And then below our, say, 5 billion, you've got Poland with 2.5 billion, Germany with 2.4 billion, Canada with 1.3 billion, everybody else is lower than that. So, as usual, we're the second biggest, but there's a big gap between us and the United States, of course.
And Simon, you've been talking to both military and industry voices at the Arms and Equipment Trade Fair, DSEI, haven't you?
Yeah, I have. It was a huge fair this year, biggest in the 24-year history of DSEI. Lots of innovations you'd expect on show, and obviously driven to a large part by what we're seeing in Ukraine. Many more UAVs I noticed on show, many more loitering munitions than I remember even back in 2021. And to flesh out what Mike was talking about, in terms of the numbers, there's a report saying $25 billion will be spent just on armoured vehicles alone in the next 10 years or so. And the loitering munitions market, that's going to grow by 525% in just the years since 2020. Spending going to reach about £600 million a year on those. And if you remember, Ben Wallace was talking about Ukraine being a battle lab. And, sadly, that is really what it's become. And you can see the sort of weapons and munitions that are coming down the track. Ukraine is obviously a very artillery-driven conflict, and BAE Systems, I spoke to them quite a lot actually, and they're unveiling a new 155mm artillery shell. And I managed to grab a word with Steve Cardew, who's the director, the firm's business development and strategy director. It was a very noisy stand, so apologies for that. But I asked him about how they're responding to the demand in Ukraine and the demand that it's creating.
I think, in the aftermath of the conflict, we obviously have a long-term ammunition relationship with the UK MOD. And very, very quickly we mobilised. We had a whole series of joint meetings and workshops around what is the UK requirement, what's the UK response needed. Our role was to offer innovation in terms of how we could quickly scale production and meet the demands that the UK MOD were placing on us. It is a significant uplift. We're designing our facility to be an 8-fold increase over what we had previously. But I think, you only have to look at the media to see the exact scale of what's being fired on a daily basis.
What he's talking about, there's a new machining plant opening in the northeast to machine 155mm ordnance. There's a new factory in South Wales. And I asked Steve about that investment and also about a new 155mm round that they're developing, which is called the Next Generation Adaptive Ammunition, or NGA.
Yeah, so I think we sort of recognise that, ammunition manufacturing has been unchanged for probably the best part of 100 years. And actually, the conflict in Ukraine forces us to rethink about how we approach that. The reality is there are a whole bunch of new technologies that we could be employing to manufacture ammunition, which are common with other sectors. So if we can harness that, what it allows us to do is to use a broader range of facilities for production and therefore scale ammunition much more quickly than we're able to do today.
And BAE actually are also, you may have read, opening an entity, an office in Ukraine as well. They're looking to help Kyiv produce some light artillery guns in the future. And I finished our chat by asking Steve what he and his colleagues really are taking, what their reflections are on watching this artillery war in Ukraine unfold.
Well, I think, the conflict is horrible, isn't it? I mean, it's a tremendous personal tragedy, and I think, for me, for the people in our business, we sort of reflect on that, and we see that on the news every day. I think it's galvanised us. We have a role to play as industry in the UK. We need to be able to step up our ammunition as quickly as we can, and we need to support our UK customer with their response to supporting the Ukrainians in the conflict.
And Mike, how generally has the conflict led to new equipment and munitions?
Oh, quite a lot. I mean, a lot of improvisation and lots of opportunities here for small, medium enterprises to work with the big primes with new ideas, bringing together technologies that don't normally fit together but do now. Because, I think the Ukraine war has shown almost like a new domain of conflict, which is the area above or below 5,000 feet, above the ground, up to 5,000 feet. And, we talk about the domains of warfare, air, sea, land, space, cyber. Well, it's almost like there's a new domain, which we ought to call the 5,000 feet strip. And within that's drones, loitering munitions, lots of electronic jamming. The aircraft, in a sense, have to operate above that. But below 5,000 feet is a whole new domain of warfare. And the Ukraine conflict is really, we always knew about it, but the Ukraine conflict has highlighted just how important that is to everything else that goes on above it and below it.
Really interesting. Simon, you've also been talking to Ukrainian defence industry voices.
Yeah, and some that actually, inhabit that domain. Mike was talking about there was a stand for Ukraine, very close to BAE actually, and on that stand they had a small company called Jet, who are just a very small startup showing videos of the kamikaze drones that they make in Kyiv. They're showing videos of them hitting the Russian tanks and APCs, videos we've all seen on social media. Now, they weren't allowed to tell me how many of these they actually make, but it is a large number, I can tell you. And they also make their own explosive containers that they drop from these drones. And I spoke to a young lady called Maria, and she told me how this company started out.
So our engineer, this was his hobby before the war. And then the war started, and he decided to use such drones for defending our country, for defending our soldiers, and it just goes to mass production, mass using as well on the front by soldiers, by our Ukrainian soldiers.
So this was effectively a guy whose hobby it was to do drones, and he's turned it into this. Tell me a bit about the drone and what you use it for. Okay,
the drone has different components, and we assemble it in Ukraine. It also has the bomb part, which you can also use any grenades or something, but we make our own bombs. The drone is one-way go, usually kamikaze. We call them kamikaze FPV drone. You aim the target, and it just goes boom, and you lose those money, but your enemy also loses the tank or something,
And that has a range of 16 kilometers, you were saying?
Yeah, the range is 16 kilometers at least.
For the kamikaze drone, 16
kilometers?
For
the kamikaze drones. If you want to reuse it, the range will be less because you have to come back by the drone. Also, why I like kamikaze, because you just send it to the target and you can pack your things and go. When you have to reuse the drone, you have to get it back, to put it in the bag, and it takes a lot of time and a lot of people.
And you were telling me you were studying engineering at university?
I used to, yes.
And you probably had ambitions to become an engineer, and now you're doing this?
Yes, I had to,
You could have left Ukraine, I guess, if you wanted to, perhaps, but you...
Never had a thought of leaving Ukraine. It's my home, my homeland. Never betrayed,
And you've lost friends of yours, you were saying you deal with the military quite a lot?
Yeah. In the military sphere, you have many friends, many relatives out there, and you think of them every day, every hour, every second. And sometimes we get information about their deaths or something, injuries, and it's really hard. So that's why we work on such products. We have to.
So Simon, a sense there of some of the manufacturing the Ukrainians have been doing themselves. You also spoke to some Australian manufacturers.
Yes, I spoke to a company called SciPac, who are another kind of well-known now company. They're making these cardboard drones that you might have seen, used in Ukraine. These can fly about 100 kilometres or so. These are aircraft drones, almost like a model aircraft, really. They cost about £2,500 each. You can put a shoebox-sized payload inside them, and they're literally held together with elastic bands. It's quite incredible. And these were the drones that Ukrainians used to hit Kursk airfield back at the end of last month. That's actually inside Russia, managing to damage a MiG-29 and 4 Su-30 fighters. And also an air defence system. These are really cheap, pretty stealthy aircraft because they're made of cardboard. And in the case of Kursk, the interesting thing there is they didn't have to obliterate those jets, their 4th gen jets. They just did enough to blow a hole effectively in those aircraft and put them out of action.
Mike, how much of an impact generally have drones been having in the battle overall?
Quite a big one, both for surveillance and destruction. As Simon said, one of the interesting things is you don't have to carry a big payload to do some military damage. You can put things out of action. And these SIPAC drones are very interesting in a negative way as well. The West supplies kit to Ukraine on the strict understanding that it does not use it to attack Russia directly. These little cardboard drones have attacked Kursk airfield inside Russia. Who supplies them? Australia. That's a Western country. This is where I really worry about these drone attacks inside Russia, because it actually creates a grey area that supports the Russian narrative that the West and Western equipment, and it may be cardboard, but it's Western equipment attacking Russia itself. Big issue, this.
Yeah, an important point. And Simon, there have been many discussions at DSEI about the impact of Ukraine on UK military strategy.
Yeah, clearly a very, very big talking point. And I went to a breakfast briefing yesterday, very well attended, lots of interest. And it's the focus of the Joint Warfare Directorate of the MOD. And I spoke to Rear Admiral Andrew Betton, who is the Director of Joint Warfare at UK Strategic Command.
Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine has presented many different opportunities for defence in the UK, but actually around the world, to reflect on what we see unfolding there and critically to learn from the experience of others. Clearly, we work closely in support of our partners in Ukraine, but also with NATO allies to help Ukraine adapt and develop their own capabilities in response to the current conflict. But through the formation of a specific team called the Russia-Ukraine Insights Hub, established last year, we've done a lot of research to distill the huge amount of information available from across academia, industry, and international defence fora to work out how we can best move forward on those lessons and insights, not just in our support to Ukraine, but in the future development of UK defence.
So you're not looking so much at the kind of tactical stuff. That's for others to look at. You're looking at more of almost a national picture.
Well, from an MOD perspective, we're seeking to take a broader view, but we work very closely with the single domain warfare centres, who are focused more at the tactical and lower operational level. My task has been to look at the upper operational and strategic implications and the opportunities for us to learn from this tragedy, learn from this experience to inform our future development of the MOD, but also our linkages, particularly with other levers of national power and critically here at DSEI with industry.
So could you give me a couple of examples maybe of things that you've learned, you've drawn from Ukraine?
There are many very well publicised examples of the speed of adaptation that we're witnessing on both sides of the conflict in Ukraine, with uncrewed systems perhaps being the most prevalent. But many of the well-identified previous lessons about the scale of stockpiles, the depth of our capacity and the credibility of that capacity have really come home to roost in what we've witnessed over the last 18 months. So this is again a wake-up call to the UK, but specifically to defence, to get after some of those longer-term problems, but also recognise the way in which modern warfare has evolved, the speed of adaptation, the necessity of agility across the whole defence industrial complex to be able to tackle the challenges that you face in the modern world.
And you were talking about also the MOD looking at it itself this morning, being honest about where it's good, where it's not so good, and making some changes there.
Yes, over many years we have audited certain capabilities and conducted reviews, and we learn the lessons or identify the lessons from all sorts of activities. Historically, we have not been so good at learning them and applying those lessons and drawing appropriately directly on the insights from activities and operations that we're engaged in. The big difference with Ukraine is this is a conflict in which we are not directly engaged, but we have the opportunity to draw some really detailed insights, not just from open source media, and there is an awful lot of that, the academic and industrial analysis, but also our very close relationship with the Ukrainian military and with across the NATO alliance that gives us unprecedented insights into a rapidly evolving campaign across all areas. The brutality, the physicality, in many ways back to sort of early 1900 trench warfare, but then at the other end of the spectrum, hugely modern, rapidly evolving, embracing of technology.
You're a very experienced military officer. I mean, how impressed have you been with the Ukrainian commanders that you've had contact with, and also what have you learned from them?
I think it's very important to bear in mind that the situation in Ukraine presents opportunities for many people beyond Ukraine, as well as those on the battlefield. So the interaction between Ukrainian military international partners has been an extraordinary opportunity for us. But we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that our potential adversaries, including Russia in this instance as the aggressor in Ukraine, are learning from this experience too. And the speed with which they are adapting and learning is also impressive. Generally speaking, we're very quick to praise Ukrainian progress and adaptability and that their audacious tactics, but the Ukrainians are also exposing this adaptability and agility to everybody else who's looking at it. So Russians, any other potential aggressors, non-state actors are also learning from that experience. But the resilience and the national unity that we've seen from the Ukrainian people is humbling.
So if you had a crystal ball and you were looking ahead, 10 years, the information that you're gleaning and the lessons learned, what do you think that's going to mean for the UK military, in a decade's time perhaps? What do you think how it might be different?
This is the experience of the Ukraine conflict is absolutely a tragedy, but it is, I think, a once-in-a-generation opportunity to draw really profound insights and lessons from a modern Western battlefield that will accelerate our development towards the future integrated force and reinforce the criticality of the relationship between the military, other arms of government and our industrial base. It has to be seen as a totality, and extending from that the resilience of our population, the ability to scale up not just the defence supply chain, but if necessary, defence itself. So the importance of our reserves and the ability to expand that reserve in time of national need.
That was Rear Admiral Andrew Betton. Really interesting, Simon. Where can we see the rest of the interviews and things you've been gathering that from DSEI?
Well, they'll be on our Forces News website, forces.net, and across our social media channels in the next couple of days. So, yeah, really interesting chat with him.
Thanks, Simon. Well, the head of the Army, General Sir Patrick Sanders, recently stressed how important it is to build the lessons of Ukraine into the UK's own force design.
Of course, the war has been a crucible for learning and adaptation, and perhaps the biggest lesson. I mean, there are. I could talk all day about the lessons that we draw from Ukraine and how we're building that into our own force design. How it's affected future soldier, but perhaps the two most important things are, first of all, the importance of morale and of will. It's very clear, the two armies that are fighting on that battlefield, which one has the most powerful sense of will and cohesion, and that in warfare will always see you through. And then the second is around adaptability. So, it's Darwinian. The species that adapts the fastest is the one that prevails and survives, not necessarily the strongest.
And how significant within that discussion is, the emergence truly of drone warfare and the amount of drones that are involved in this conflict? Hugely.
But we shouldn't get ourselves drawn into sort of techno-fetishism or assuming that changes in technology will change the nature of war itself. The battles with the drones are critically important, and we've invested 10.5 million just this year in making sure that when our troops train in places like Salisbury Plain, they've got swarms of drones over them so that they can adapt and also learn how to exploit them themselves. But equally, the numbers of casualties, the rates of advance, the number of armoured vehicles and tanks that are lost to drones actually hasn't changed significantly in this conflict compared to previous conflicts as well. So you won't win if you don't constantly adapt and you don't exploit these new techniques and procedures. That's why the adaptation matters so much. But the advantage is always quite slight because the enemy then responds. So it's a constant process of adaptation.
And you can hear the full interview with General Sanders talking to Sean Greszczak on our radio app or wherever you get your Sitrep podcast. Mike, just going back to that interview that Simon did with the Director of Joint Warfare at UK Strategic Command, just how crucial is that work that's being done by Rear Admiral Andrew Betton and his team?
Oh yeah, it's fundamental to modern warfare because it's so important to get combined arms operations moving properly and to make sure that they're consistent with a strategic plan. I mean, all wars, somebody said to me that wars are where leaders wrestle with chaos. That's what you're doing. You're wrestling with chaos. And that's in the nature of warfare. And so the ability to maintain some control over that is really, really important. And of course, I mean, the benefits are only marginal as between one force and another. But those marginal benefits are critical. If one force is 85% good at them and one force is 90% good at them, you know who's going to win.
Interesting what General Sanders is saying about new technologies there as well and the adaptability.
Yeah, it still comes down to people. As he said, the nature of warfare doesn't change. The characteristics change all the time. The way wars are fought is constantly changing. But the nature of warfare, it's a struggle of willpower in the use of lethal force. And you win that battle of willpower, both by the morale of your forces, their sort of psychological moral force, but also their adaptability. And you can have the best technology in the world. You still have to have the people who can operate it with imagination and adaptability. And I think, as he says, that hasn't changed since the days of Alexander the Great.
News, discussions and analysis. This is Sitrep.
Well, the message that armed forces should have learnt the lessons of previous wars in Europe is at the heart of a new book. It's by former head of the Army, General Lord Dannatt, along with Robert Lyman, and is called Victory to Defeat, the British Army 1918 to 1940. The book's just out, and I caught up earlier with Richard Dannatt.
The really important thing is that in the 20s and 30s, after the First World War, there was such a feeling in this country that the First World War was so ghastly, so awful, that there must never be another war. It was indeed to be the war to end wars. And in fact, that was then articulated in government policy, that there would be no planning for a major war for 10 years. And that rolled forward year on year. And of course, with that policy in place, it was possible for the Chancellor of the Exchequer of the day to really put very little money into our defence budget. Well, that was fine, probably through the 20s and early 30s, despite the difficult economic situation of the Wall Street crash and the Great Depression and the general strike. But still, we were spending nothing much on defense. But then in 1933, Hitler came to power and gradually wanted to show that he wanted to expand German influence. He wanted to embrace into a greater Germany all the German-speaking peoples, which is why he then occupied the Rhineland in 1936, threatened to take over, and then did take over chunks of Czechoslovakia. And eventually our government confronted him in the Munich Agreement and tried to appease him in 1938. Appeasement failed, and only then did the British government decide that they had to rapidly start to rearm. Well, we began to put some more money into the Air Force, fortunately just enough money to procure enough fighters to eventually win the Battle of Britain later in 1940, but very little money went into our army, with the result that when the Germans attacked in May-June 1940 with a very modernized army based around what we call popularly blitzkrieg, an armored force spearheading their attack, the French army and the British Expeditionary Force were no match for them. And very sadly, we were defeated in France. Fortunately, the army was not annihilated because Lord Gaunt, the Commander-in-Chief, made the very sensible decision to evacuate via Dunkirk and save the army. But the big point really is that came about because we were too slow to heed the growing threat in Europe. Big question today is there is a huge threat in Europe, not just a threat. We've already seen Putin conducting an ugly war in Ukraine. The question today is, are we rearming? Are we putting more money into our defense budget? No, we're not. So are we doomed to have to learn the lesson of history again?
And to drill down a little bit more into the detail that you outline in the book, Great Britain had put its largest army ever into the field during the First World War. And you write that between August and November in 1918, it found the formula for operational and tactical success on the battlefield. Can you describe a bit more about that?
Absolutely. And this is absolutely key to the book. The popular image of the First World War is of lions led by donkeys, generals who didn't know what they were doing, and long lines of British troops getting up out of their trenches and advancing shoulder to shoulder, slowly across no man's land into the teeth of German guns and being killed in large numbers. And of course, on the 1st of July 1916, on the first day of the Battle of the Somme, that was pretty much what happened. But that was because it was a brand new army, hastily recruited, and the level of training was such that they couldn't really expect large numbers of troops to act in any other way. But lessons began to be learnt very quickly, and tactics changed and the approach to warfare changed, so that by the 100 Days campaign of August to November 1918, the British Army had become much more sophisticated, had integrated infantry with armour, with artillery, much better communications, integrated the air component to be able to spot from the air, and also the beginnings of what we now call mission command. Rather than just soldiers advancing in serried ranks, units were given objectives, the commanding officers were given some latitude as to how to go about it, and we had the early beginnings of what we now call a maneuverist approach to warfare. And that was very successful. The tragedy is, going back to the earlier point, is that there was such a determination that this will be the war to end wars. Our huge army was demobilized very quickly. There was a 10-year rule in place, but critically also, the army failed to capitalize on taking into its inner core, into its DNA, the lessons that it painfully learnt and demonstrated so successfully in the 100 Days campaign of 1918. In the late 20s, early 30s, there was some mild experimentation with the tank force, but it came to nothing. So consequently, when our army deployed in 1939, it was a large army, pretty poorly trained actually, a lot of territorial divisions sent to France without much equipment or training, some of them just actually sent to dig trenches. They were mechanized in lorries, but they faced an enemy who had seen what had happened in 1918, had seen how you could integrate armor and infantry and air very effectively. And they had learned the lessons and embodied them into their army which broke through the Ardennes and attacked us in May, June 1940. And we really had no answer for it. And it was a real tragedy. So there are political reasons, economic reasons, that the army has to take some responsibility for not having taken into itself the war-fighting doctrine that it had learned so painfully during the course of the First World War.
That was General Lord Dannatt. Mike, interesting listening to what he had to say there. Do you necessarily have to be a good historian to be a good military leader?
No, but it helps, as Lord Dannatt, I think, was making clear. I think all military leaders take their early experiences into senior levels with them. And I mean, he mentioned there, John Gort, and it was the same with Montgomery, with Slim, with Alexander. They were all First World War people. And of course, Gort and Montgomery and Alexander were all Western Front men. Slim was a Middle East man in the First World War. And they take those experiences with them. And they, as it were, learn from that. But the point is that, history... They need to have a sense of historical perspective. I mean, history doesn't repeat itself, but my goodness, it rhymes. It's often been said by many people. History doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. And in military affairs, those rhymes are quite loud and persistent. And you've got to actually understand those rhymes, but put them into perspective. And that's really what the military commander has always had to try to do.
Mike, great to speak to you today. Thank you so much for your time. And my thanks to all of our guests. That's all for now. We'll be back with another Sitrep next Thursday. If you want to listen online, you can do so now by finding us on Forces News YouTube channel where we are, as well as our home at bfbs.com/sitrep or wherever you download your podcasts. For now, though, from me, Kate Gerbeau, Thanks for listening. Bye-bye.